The stagecoach lurched to a stop, sending up a cloud of red dust that coated everything in sight. Clara Whitmore pressed a handkerchief to her nose, squinting through the haze at the collection of weathered buildings that comprised Dust Hollow, New Mexico territory. After 3 weeks of bone-jarring travel from Philadelphia, she had finally arrived at what was to be her new home. "End of the line, miss," the driver called down, his voice rough as sandpaper. "This here's your stop." Clara gathered her traveling dress, now stained with the dirt of 1,000 miles, and accepted the driver's calloused hand as he helped her down. Her legs trembled on solid ground, whether from exhaustion or nerves, she couldn't say. In her reticule, she clutched the bundle of letters from Emmett Harland, letters that had painted a picture of a gentle, educated man seeking companionship in this harsh frontier. Letters that had promised her escape from poverty and her father's drunken rages. "The Harland place?" she asked the driver, who was already tossing her single trunk into the dust. He spat tobacco juice and pointed down the main street. "Third building past the saloon. Got a blue door, or what's left of it." His eyes, buried in a nest of sun-carved wrinkles, held something she couldn't read. Pity, perhaps. "You sure you're expected, miss?" "Of course I'm expected." Clara lifted her chin, though doubt gnawed at her stomach. Emmett's last letter had arrived 2 months ago, but mail was unreliable out here. That's what she told herself. The driver shrugged and climbed back onto his perch. Within moments, the stagecoach rattled away, leaving Clara alone on the packed earth street of Dust Hollow. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and she could feel perspiration gathering beneath her corset. A few townspeople paused to stare, women in faded calico, men with suspicious eyes beneath wide-brimmed hats. No one offered greeting or assistance. Clara hefted her trunk, struggling with its weight, and began the walk toward Emmett's home. The saloon door swung open as she passed, releasing the stench of whiskey and unwashed bodies. A man stumbled out, leered at her, then seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to say. The blue door, when she found it, was indeed barely blue anymore, sun-bleached to a ghostly gray, hanging crooked on its hinges. Clara set down her trunk and knocked. The sound echoed hollow, like rapping on a coffin. She knocked again, harder. "Nobody there," a woman's voice said. Clara turned to find a severe-looking matron in black bombazine, arms crossed over her chest. This was Mrs. Henderson, she realized, Emmett's landlady, who'd been mentioned in his letters. "I'm Clara Whitmore," she said, attempting a smile. "Mr. Harland's intended. He's expecting me." Something flickered across Mrs. Henderson's face. Surprise. Then something harder. "Expecting you? Child, Emmett Harland's been in the ground 2 weeks now. Gold fever took him, along with 3 others. The world tilted. Clara gripped the door frame to keep from falling. That's not possible. I have his letters. He wrote to me. We were to be married. Well, you're 2 weeks too late for a wedding and just in time for nothing." Mrs. Henderson's voice held no sympathy. "He died owing me 2 months' rent. Had to sell his belongings to cover it. Nothing left but dust and debt." Clara's mind reeled. 3,000 miles. Every penny she'd saved or stolen from her father's drinking money, spent on this journey. "I have nowhere else to go," she heard herself say. "That's not my problem." Mrs. Henderson's eyes were hard as flint. "Boarding house is full up, and even if it weren't, you got money for rent?" Clara's hand went instinctively to her reticule. $3.40. All that remained after the stage fare. Not enough for even a week's lodging. She knew. "Perhaps I could work." "Doing what?" "We got no need for another seamstress or washerwoman. Got plenty of those already. And they got families to feed." Mrs. Henderson started to turn away, then paused. "There's work at the saloon, if you're that type. Otherwise, best catch tomorrow's stage back east." "I can't." The words came out as barely a whisper. "I spent everything to come here." "Mrs. Henderson shrugged. "Then I suggest you start praying. Good day." Clara stood frozen as the woman walked away, her black dress sweeping the dusty street. The sun was sinking lower, painting the sky the color of blood. Soon it would be dark, and she had nowhere to go. The respectable women she'd noticed earlier now deliberately avoided looking her way, as if poverty might be contagious. Desperation drove her to the small Catholic church at the end of the street. Surely a man of God would show Christian charity. Father Miguel was a thin, tired-looking man with kind eyes that dimmed when she explained her plight. "I wish I could help, child," he said, and he did seem genuinely regretful. "But we already shelter 2 widows and 5 orphans. Our resources are stretched beyond breaking. Perhaps if you could reach the next town." "How far is the next town?" 60 miles north. 60 miles through desert and Apache territory. Might as well be 600. Clara thanked him and left, her trunk growing heavier with each step. The sun had nearly set now, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. She'd heard the desert turned cold at night but hadn't believed it until now. At the edge of town, she found a livery stable. The owner had gone home, but the doors were unlocked. Clara slipped inside, the smell of hay and horses oddly comforting after the hostility of the town. She made a nest in an empty stall, using her trunk as a pillow and covering herself with her travel cloak. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. She'd eaten nothing since a meager breakfast at the last way station. But worse than hunger was the crushing weight of her situation. No money, no prospects, no way home. Not that home had ever been a place worth returning to. She'd burned that bridge by stealing from her father and leaving a note saying she'd found a husband. He'd kill her if she went back. If the shame didn't kill her first. Clara must have dozed, because she woke to the sound of voices, male voices, speaking in low tones just outside the stable. Her heart hammered as she pressed herself deeper into the hay. "Told you he wouldn't sell to no half-breed," one voice said. "I got money same as anyone." This voice was different, deeper, controlled, despite the anger she could hear beneath it. "His father needs that medicine." "Don't matter. Jake don't do business with your kind. Best head back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Clara heard footsteps approaching her hiding spot and held her breath. A figure appeared in the doorway of the stall, tall, broad-shouldered, silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through the stable doors. She could make out long, dark hair, clothes that were a mix of white man's pants and native leather. He stood perfectly still, and she knew he'd seen her. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he stepped closer, and moonlight illuminated his face, angular features that spoke of mixed heritage, dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "You're the woman from the stage," he said. "It wasn't a question." Clara nodded, unable to find her voice. He studied her for another moment, taking in her rumpled dress, her trunk, the hay in her hair. Then he reached into his coat and pulled something out. "Here," he said, extending his hand. It was a piece of dried meat, wrapped in cloth. Clara's stomach clenched with hunger, but pride kept her from reaching for it immediately. "I don't need charity," she managed. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No? Then what do you call sleeping in a stable?" Heat flooded her cheeks, but before she could respond, he set the food on her trunk. "Eat," he said. "Desert's no place to starve." He turned to go, and something, desperation, perhaps, made her call out. "Wait, please." He paused, looking back. "I heard them. Those men, they wouldn't sell you medicine." His jaw tightened. "No concern of yours. But your father can wait another day." He studied her again, and something in his expression shifted. "You got nowhere to go." Again, not a question. Clara lifted her chin. "I'll manage." "Sure you will. Same way a rabbit manages in a den of wolves." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I got a place. Day's ride into the canyon country. It's rough living, but there's shelter. Food." Clara's heart pounded. Go off into the wilderness with a stranger, a half-breed, as the townspeople had so crudely put it? Everything she'd been taught said this was madness. But then, everything she'd been taught hadn't prepared her for being abandoned and penniless in a hostile town. "Why would you help me?" she asked. He shrugged. "Maybe I know what it's like to have doors shut in your face." He turned to go again, Eat the food. Think on it. I'll be back at dawn. Gotta try the Mexican trader for those medicines. You want to come? Be ready. I don't even know your name. He paused at the threshold. Tomas Red Elk. Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone with a piece of dried meat and the biggest decision of her life. Outside, a coyote howled, and the sound raised goose flesh on her arms. She thought of the hostile faces in town, of Mrs. Henderson's cold dismissal, of the father who'd drink himself into rages back in Philadelphia. Then she thought of dark eyes that had seen her desperation without judgment, of a voice that offered shelter without conditions. Clara reached for the dried meat and took a bite. It was tough, salty, but it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. As she chewed, she made her decision. At dawn, she would be ready. True to his word. Thomas appeared at dawn, leading 2 horses, a painted mare for riding and a pack mule loaded with supplies. Clara stood waiting, her trunk beside her, having spent the sleepless hours questioning her sanity. In the gray morning light, she could see him more clearly. Worn leather vest over a cotton shirt, faded cavalry pants tucked into high boots, a rifle secured to his saddle. His dark hair was tied back, revealing a face that might have been handsome if not for the guarded expression he wore like armor. "Changed your mind?" he asked, already moving to secure her trunk to the pack mule. "No." The word came out more firmly than she felt. He nodded, checking the ropes with practiced efficiency. "Can you ride?" "A little." She'd ridden her uncle's old plow horse as a child, though that seemed a lifetime ago. "That'll have to do." He helped her mount, his hands impersonal as they guided her foot to the stirrup. "We'll go slow at first. Desert's got its own rules. Break them, and it'll kill you sure as a bullet." They rode out as the sun crested the horizon, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Clara looked back once at Dust Hollow, already small in the distance, then fixed her gaze forward. Whatever lay ahead couldn't be worse than what she was leaving behind. The first hours tested every muscle in her body. The mare had an easy gait, but Clara's riding dress was ill-suited for the saddle, and the sun climbed mercilessly higher. Thomas rode slightly ahead, scanning the horizon with the watchfulness of a man who'd learned not to trust the world's empty spaces. He stopped frequently to check on her, offering water from his canteen, adjusting her horse's gait, all without unnecessary words. By midday, the landscape had transformed. The scattered buildings and fenced plots gave way to raw wilderness, towering red rocks that looked like God's own architecture, deep arroyos carved by long-dead rivers, sparse vegetation clinging to life in the sandy soil. Clara had never seen anything so desolate or so beautiful. "We'll rest here," Tomas said, guiding them into the shade of an enormous boulder. He helped her dismount, and her legs nearly buckled. "Walk it off," he advised. "Gets easier." While Clara walked in small circles, trying to restore feeling to her limbs, Thomas tended the horses and produced a simple meal: cold biscuits, more dried meat, a handful of piñon nuts. They ate in companionable silence. The only sounds the horses' breathing and the distant cry of a hawk. "How far?" Clara finally asked. "By nightfall, if we keep pace." He glanced at her, assessing. "You're doing better than I expected. Did you expect me to faint? Demand to turn back?" That ghost smile again. "Something like that. I'm stronger than I look." "Maybe so." He packed away the remains of their meal. Still, strength's not just in the body. Desert has ways of testing a person's spirit. They remounted and continued deeper into the canyon country. The trail, if it could be called that, wound between massive stone formations, down into dry washes, up steep ridges that made Clara's heart pound with more than exertion. Sometimes the path seemed to disappear entirely, but Tomas never hesitated, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to her eyes. Late afternoon brought them to a sight that stopped Clara's breath, a deep canyon system spreading before them like a maze carved by giants, layers of red and orange rock descending into purple shadows. Far below, she could see a ribbon of green, cottonwood trees marking the presence of water, Home, Thomas said simply. The descent was treacherous. Clara gripped her saddle horn, trusting the mare's sure feet as they picked their way down a path that seemed better suited to mountain goats than horses. More than once, loose rocks clattered over the edge, falling for seconds before hitting bottom. She didn't look down. At last, they reached the canyon floor, where the temperature dropped 10 degrees and the sound of running water filled the air. Clara could have wept at the sight of the small stream, clear and cold, bubbling over smooth stones. The cottonwoods provided blessed shade, their leaves whispering secrets in the breeze. Thomas's home sat on a rise above the stream, a log structure built against the canyon wall, modest but solid. A corral held 2 horses. A garden plot showed signs of recent tending. Smoke rose from a chimney pipe, and as they approached, a figure emerged from the cabin, an elderly native man, thin and stooped, who called out something in a language Clara didn't understand. Thomas answered in the same tongue. Dismounting quickly, the old man's face creased with obvious relief, though his eyes went immediately to Clara with undisguised curiosity. "My father," Thomas said simply. "Joseph Red Elk." Clara dismounted carefully, smoothing her dusty skirts, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. "Mr. Red Elk," she said, offering a small curtsy that felt absurd in the circumstances. The old man's eyes crinkled with what might have been amusement. "Welcome," he said in accented English. "You're the woman from town?" Clara glanced at Thomas, wondering what he'd said about her, but his expression revealed nothing. "Yes," she said, "I'm Clara Whitmore." Joseph nodded slowly, then said something to his son in their language. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he responded calmly before turning back to Clara. "He needs rest. I'll show you where you can sleep." The cabin's interior was spare but clean, a main room with a fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, herbs hanging from the rafters. A ladder led to what appeared to be a loft. Thomas gestured to a corner where a simple bed frame held a mattress stuffed with what smelled like sweet grass. "This was my mother's," he said. "You can use it. Where will you sleep?" "Outside. Weather's good for it." He moved to a trunk at the foot of the bed, pulling out folded cloth. "Her clothes might fit, more practical than what you're wearing." Clara fingered the simple cotton dress, the leather leggings, his mother's belongings, preserved with evident care. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded and moved toward the door. "Stream's good for washing. Privy's out back. I'll start supper." Left alone, Clara sank onto the bed, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of exhaustion and emotion. 24 hours ago, she'd been planning her wedding to a dead man. Now she sat in a stranger's home, wearing a dead woman's clothes, with no idea what tomorrow would bring. Through the window, she watched Thomas moving about outside, tending the horses, gathering wood, checking on his father. His movements were economical, purposeful, those of a man accustomed to self-sufficiency. When he paused by the stream to wash the trail dust from his face, she saw him in profile, the sharp cheekbones, the firm line of his jaw, the way the setting sun caught copper highlights in his dark hair. He was handsome, she realized with a start, not in the soft way of Eastern gentlemen, but in something harder, more elemental. The thought brought heat to her cheeks, and she turned away from the window. Supper was a simple affair. Venison stew, corn cakes, wild greens Thomas had gathered. They ate outside, watching the last light fade from the canyon walls. Joseph Red Elk joined them briefly, though Clara could see the effort it cost him. His breathing was labored, and he coughed frequently into a cloth. "How long has he been ill?" Clara asked when Joseph had retired inside. 2 months, getting worse." Thomas stared into the dying fire. "White doctor in town won't come here. Mexican trader promised medicine, but," he shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its resignation. "The men last night, they mentioned Jake? Jake Morrison, owns the general store. His father needs the same medicine." A bitter smile touched his lips. "But he'd rather see us both dead than sell to a half-breed." The words sat heavy between them. Clara had heard it all her life, always spoken with contempt, but never had she considered the human weight of it, to belong nowhere, accepted by neither world. Your mother, she ventured. Was she white, schoolteacher from Ohio? Came west to teach Indian children, fell in love with the wrong man. He poked at the fire with a stick. They hanged her for it. I was 12. Clara's breath caught. I'm sorry, he shrugged again, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. Long time ago. They sat in silence as darkness settled over the canyon. Strange sounds filled the night. The yip of coyotes, the rustle of unseen creatures, the haunting call of an owl. Clara shivered despite the warmth from the fire. You're afraid, Thomas observed. It's also vast, empty. Not empty, just different. He added another log to the fire. Give it time. Desert shows its secrets slowly. And if I don't have time, if I need to leave. He looked at her directly then, firelight dancing in his dark eyes. Where would you go? The question hung between them, unanswerable. Clara pulled the borrowed shawl tighter around her shoulders. Nowhere. The answer was nowhere. Then I suppose I'll have to learn, she said finally. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. First lesson tomorrow, how to find water. Can't survive without it. All right. He stood, banking the fire for the night. You should sleep. Desert wakes early. Clara rose as well, pausing at the cabin door. Thomas, thank you for... She gestured helplessly at everything. The rescue, the shelter, the acceptance, without questions. You'd have done the same, he said quietly. Would she? Clara wasn't sure. Her world had been one of strict social boundaries, where a woman didn't speak to strange men, certainly didn't ride off into the wilderness with them. Yet here she was, trusting her life to a man her society would condemn, finding more kindness in his simple gestures than in all the proper Christians of Dust Hollow. That night, lying in a bed that had belonged to a woman hanged for love, Clara stared up at the rough-hewn ceiling and wondered if she'd finally found a place where she might belong, or if the desert would swallow her whole like it had swallowed so many dreams before. The days fell into a rhythm as foreign to Clara as the landscape itself. Dawn came with Thomas's quiet movements outside, the sound of him tending horses and checking his trap lines. By the time she emerged, dressed in his mother's practical clothing, he would have coffee brewing over the fire, bitter and strong, nothing like the tea she was accustomed to. But she learned to savor its heat against the morning chill. Today, water, he announced that first morning, handing her an empty canteen. Most important lesson. Clara followed him along the stream, watching as he pointed out signs she would never have noticed. The particular bend where water ran deepest, the rocks that marked clean springs versus stagnant pools, the types of vegetation that indicated water even in dry washes. See the cottonwoods? He gestured upstream. Deep roots, always find water. But here, he indicated a cluster of different trees. A patchy willow, shallow water, might go dry in summer. She tried to memorize everything, acutely aware of how her survival might depend on such knowledge. When he showed her how to dig for water in a dry stream bed, she knelt beside him, not caring that dirt caked under her fingernails. The old Clara would have been horrified. This new Clara felt triumph when water began seeping into the hole they'd dug. Fire came next. Not the simple lighting of matches she knew, but the art of building fires that would last, that would provide heat without smoke to mark their location, that could be banked to smolder through the night. Her fingers were clumsy with the flint and steel, producing sparks that died before catching the tinder. Patience, Thomas said, his hand covering hers to guide the motion. Like this. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with fire-making. She focused on the task, finally producing a flame that caught and held. Good, he said simply, but she heard approval in it. Setting snares proved more challenging. The intricate knots required dexterity her soft hands hadn't developed. Time after time, her trap fell apart at a touch. Thomas demonstrated repeatedly, never showing impatience, though she grew frustrated with her own clumsiness. "I'm hopeless," she declared after her dozenth failure. "No, you're learning." No, he reset the snare with quick efficiency. "My mother took months to get it right. City hands, like yours." "Did you teach her?" A shadow crossed his face. "My father did. I was young." He stood abruptly. "Try again." Clara recognized the wall that came down whenever his mother was mentioned. She returned to her knots, finally managing one that held. When she looked up in triumph, she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. 2 weeks passed in this manner. Each day brought new lessons: how to identify edible plants from poisonous ones, how to read weather signs in the sky, how to move quietly enough not to startle game. Clara's hands roughened. Her skin darkened despite the hat Tomas had given her, and muscles she didn't know she possessed made themselves known through constant aches. But she was surviving. More than that, she was beginning to understand the desert's harsh beauty, the way morning light painted the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold, the delicate flowers that bloomed on cacti, defiant in their beauty, the profound silence that was not empty but full of small sounds once you learned to listen. Thomas remained an enigma. He spoke little beyond instruction, disappearing for hours to hunt or gather medicines for his father. Yet she caught moments, a hand extended to help her over rough ground, extra meat in her portion at dinner, the way he'd adjusted her sleeping area to catch the morning sun but avoid the afternoon heat. Care expressed through actions rather than words. The sandstorm arrived without warning on their 16th day. Clara was gathering kindling near the cabin when the sky darkened unnaturally. Wind rose from nowhere, carrying a wall of red dust that blocked out the sun. "Inside," Thomas shouted, appearing from nowhere to grab her arm. But the cabin was too far. The wind hit with physical force, driving sand that stung like needles. Clara couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Thomas pulled her against the canyon wall, into a shallow cave she hadn't known existed. He positioned himself between her and the storm's fury, his body a shield against the worst of it. The wind howled like a living thing. Sand found every gap in their shelter, coating them in grit. Clara pressed her face against Thomas's chest, trying to breathe through the fabric of his shirt. His arms encircled her, holding her steady against the storm's violence. Time lost meaning in that roaring darkness. It might have been minutes or hours before the wind began to die, even then. Thomas didn't move, didn't release her until the air cleared enough to see. "Are you hurt?" His voice was rough, concerned. Clara lifted her head, becoming aware of how closely they were pressed together. She could feel his heartbeat, rapid from exertion or something else. "No, I'm fine." They stared at each other, faces inches apart. His hand came up to brush sand from her cheek, the touch gentle. For a moment, something electric passed between them. Then a violent coughing fit from the direction of the cabin broke the spell. Tomas released her abruptly, already moving. "My father?" They found Joseph struggling to breathe, the storm having worsened his condition. Thomas worked with grim efficiency, brewing medicine from his dwindling supply of herbs. But Clara could see the fear in his eyes. That night, she found him sitting alone by the dying fire, shoulders bowed with a weight that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "He's getting worse," Clara said softly, joining him on the log that served as a bench. "The medicine I need, there's a plant that grows in the southern mountains, but it's a 3-day journey, and I can't leave him that long." "I could go with you. We could travel faster." "No." The word came sharp, then softer. "Too dangerous. Apache territory." They sat in silence, watching embers pulse in the darkness. Finally, Clara spoke. "In Philadelphia, I help tend sick neighbors. I'm not trained, but I know some things. If you taught me what he needs, I could care for him while you're gone." Tomas turned to look at her, and in the firelight she saw surprise and something else, a vulnerability quickly masked. "Why would you do that?" "Because you saved me," she said simply, And because it's right. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, the morning doses are most important. 3 drops of the tincture in water, before food, if his breathing worsens. Clara listened carefully as he detailed his father's care, memorizing each instruction. When he finished, she impulsively reached for his hand. "He'll be all right. You'll get the medicine." His fingers tightened around hers briefly before pulling away. "I leave at first light." That night, Clara lay wakeful, aware of every sound. She heard Thomas moving about in the darkness, preparing for his journey. Just before dawn, his silhouette appeared in her doorway. 3 days, he said quietly. "If I'm not back by the 4th sunrise, you will be." He nodded and was gone. Clara rose and went to the door, watching as he saddled his horse in the pre-dawn gray. He looked back once, raising his hand in farewell, then rode into the desert, swallowed by shadows. Clara turned to find Joseph watching from his bed. "He trusts you," the old man said in his careful English. "I won't fail that trust." Joseph studied her with eyes that held surprising clarity despite his illness. "My son has been alone too long, since his mother." He coughed, struggling for breath. Clara quickly prepared his medicine, supporting him as he drank. When his breathing eased, he caught her hand. "You have good heart," he said, "like her." The comparison to Thomas's mother, a woman hanged for loving across forbidden boundaries, sent a chill through Clara. She thought of that moment in the cave, the way Thomas had looked at her, the way her heart had responded. "Rest now," she said softly, but Joseph was already drifting back to sleep. Clara spent the day maintaining the household, tending the fire, preparing simple meals, checking Joseph's condition every hour. The cabin felt empty without Thomas's quiet presence. She found herself looking up at every sound, hoping for hoofbeats that didn't come. That evening, she discovered his journal, not hidden, just left on a shelf with other books. The pages revealed a different side of the taciturn man, sketches of plants with detailed notes on their properties, observations of weather patterns, and occasionally, more personal entries. She knew she shouldn't read them, but one passage caught her eye. Found her in the stable like a lost fawn, pride intact despite everything. Mother would have liked her strength. I should have left her there, safer for us both. But those eyes, gray like storm clouds, seeing too much, I am already lost. Clara closed the journal with trembling hands. Through the window, she watched the sunset paint the canyon walls crimson. Somewhere out there, Thomas rode through dangerous territory, risking everything for his father. And here she sat, wearing his mother's clothes, caring for his father, reading words that suggested, what? She pressed her fingers to her lips, remembering the cave, the solid warmth of him shielding her from the storm. Whatever grew between them was as dangerous as the desert itself, but like the tiny flowers that bloomed on cacti, perhaps some things were worth the risk of thorns. The first night alone tested her resolve. Every sound seemed magnified. The skitter of small creatures, the distant howl of predators, the settling of logs in the fire. But Joseph needed her steady. So steady she remained, checking on him through the dark hours, keeping the fire bright against the pressing night. By the second day, she had found a rhythm. Joseph seemed to improve slightly, able to take broth and speak for longer periods. He told her stories of Thomas as a boy, wild and free before tragedy shaped him into the guarded man she knew. His mother called him her little wolf, Joseph said, smiling at the memory. Always roaming, always watching, but gentle too, would rescue injured birds, nurse them back to health. Clara could picture it, those careful hands that had taught her survival skills once cradling broken wings. The image made her heart constrict with an emotion she didn't dare name. The fever struck on the coldest night Clara had experienced in the desert. She woke to her own teeth chattering violently, her body alternating between burning heat and bone-deep chills. At first, she tried to ignore it. Joseph needed tending, the fire needed feeding. But when she attempted to rise, the world spun sickeningly, dropping her to her knees. child?" Joseph's weak voice carried from his bed. Clara crawled to the water bucket, managing to drink before another wave of chills shook her. She had to stay functional. Thomas would return tomorrow at latest, and she'd promised to care for his father. But her body betrayed her, trembling so violently she couldn't hold the medicine bottle steady. Somehow, she managed Joseph's morning dose, though half-spilled. The old man watched her with growing alarm as she stumbled about, trying to complete basic tasks. By midday, she could no longer pretend. The fever had her in its grip, and she collapsed beside the fire, pulling every blanket she could find around her shaking form. "Emmett?" she heard herself calling in her delirium. "You promised. You wrote such beautiful letters." Time became fluid. She was back in Philadelphia, her father's hand raised in anger, then on the stage, dust choking her, arriving to find death where love should have been. Tomas's face swam before her, but it kept shifting into Emmett's, the man she'd never met but had built dreams upon. "Please," she whispered to shadows, "don't leave me alone." Through the haze, she felt cool cloths on her burning forehead. Joseph had managed to leave his bed, though the effort clearly cost him. His weathered hands were gentle as he tended her, speaking soft words in his native language that sounded like prayers. Night fell again. Or perhaps it was the same night, stretching endless. Clara thrashed in her makeshift bed by the fire, the fever painting wild visions. Her mother, dead these 10 years, stood in the corner. "Foolish girl," she said, "running to strangers. You were meant for better things." "There were no better things," Clara argued with the ghost. "Only hunger and fists and shame." Then strong arms lifted her, and she knew this was another fever dream because Tomas couldn't be here. But the arms felt real, solid, carrying her to the bed she'd abandoned. His voice, urgent and frightened in a way she'd never heard. "Clara, look at me! Clara!" She tried to focus, but his face kept wavering. "You came back," she murmured. "Emmett never came, but you did. I'm here." His hand cupped her cheek, calloused and warm. "I'm not going anywhere." The fever broke near dawn. Leaving her weak as a newborn calf but lucid, she became aware of her surroundings slowly. She was in the proper bed, covered in warm furs. The fire crackled steadily, and Tomas sat beside her, his hand holding hers, his head bowed in exhaustion or prayer. "Tomas!" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. His head snapped up, relief flooding his features. "You're awake." He reached for a cup of water, supporting her head as she drank. Slowly. "You've been burning for 2 days." 2 days! Clara tried to sit up, panic rising. "Your father is fine. Better, actually. The medicine worked." He eased her back down. "Rest. You nearly—" He stopped, jaw working. "Nearly died?" Clara managed a weak smile. "Takes more than a fever to kill a city girl." But she saw in his eyes how close it had been. Saw, too, the shadows under them, the growth of beard that said he hadn't left her side. "You stayed with me." Where else would I go? The words held an echo of their first conversation, but the meaning had shifted, deepened. Over the following days, their relationship changed in subtle but profound ways. The careful distance Tomas had maintained dissolved. He tended her with a gentleness that made her throat tight. Cooking broths she could manage, reading to her from his collection of books when she grew restless, simply sitting with her in comfortable silence. "You called for him," he said one evening as she grew stronger. "Emmett, in your fever." Clara felt heat in her cheeks that had nothing to do with illness. "I suppose I did. It seems foolish now, mourning a man I never met." "Not foolish. You mourned the dream." He stared into the fire. "We all carry ghosts of what might have been." "What do you dream of?" she asked softly. He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. "Used to dream of belonging somewhere, having a place where both sides of my blood were welcome." He looked at her then, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. "Now I dream of simpler things, such as teaching someone to braid sweetgrass, watching sunset from the rim trail, waking to find certain gray eyes already smiling." The last was said so quietly she almost missed it. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers. "Thomas!" He lifted their joined hands, pressing his lips to her knuckles in a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. But then he released her, standing abruptly. "You need more rest." The moment passed, but its echo lingered in every interaction. Clara felt it when their hands brushed passing dishes, saw it in the way his eyes followed her as she moved about the cabin, sensed it in the careful space he maintained, as if proximity might shatter his control. The night everything changed started with music. Joseph, health much improved, had retrieved an old flute from his possessions. He played haunting melodies that seemed to capture the desert's soul, lonely and beautiful and wild. Clara sat mesmerized, while Thomas whittled by the fire, his hands creating a small bird from pine. "Dance," Joseph said suddenly, lowering the flute, "like Sarah used to." Thomas went very still. "Father, your mother loved to dance, would spin around this very room." The old man's eyes held mischief and sorrow. "Life is short, joy is shorter." He raised the flute again, playing a lighter tune. Clara felt the music pull at something in her chest. Without thinking, she rose and began to move. Nothing like the formal dances of Philadelphia society, but something freer, more honest. The firelight caught her borrowed dress as she turned, her hair, grown long and loose, swirling around her. When she extended her hand to Thomas, he shook his head. But she persisted. And finally, he set aside his carving and stood. His hand was warm in hers as she pulled him into the dance. At first he was stiff, uncertain. Then the music seemed to catch him too, and he spun her gently, expertly, as if his body remembered steps his mind had forgotten. They moved together in the small space, careful of furniture but lost to everything else. Clara was acutely aware of every point of contact, his hand on her waist, her palm against his shoulder, the brush of their bodies as they turned. The flute music wrapped around them like a spell. When the song ended, they stood frozen, breathing hard, still holding each other. Joseph had quietly retreated to his bed, leaving them alone in the firelight. Clara looked up into Thomas's face, seeing her own desire reflected in his dark eyes. "Clara," he said, her name a warning and a plea. She raised her hand to his cheek, feeling the rasp of stubble, the warmth of skin. "I'm not afraid. You should be." But even as he said it, he leaned into her touch. "I have nothing to offer, no proper home, no standing, no—" She silenced him by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. For a heartbeat he stood rigid. Then his arms came around her with desperate strength, and he kissed her back with all the loneliness and longing of his isolated years. When they broke apart, both were trembling. Thomas rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "This is madness." "Perhaps." Clara's voice was unsteady. "But I've been sensible all my life. And where did it lead? To an empty promise in a cold stable." She pulled back to meet his eyes. "You make me feel safe, Thomas, for the first time in my life, truly safe." Something broke in his expression. He kissed her again, softer this time, with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. When he lifted her in his arms and carried her to his bed in the loft, she went willingly, her heart beating wild as a captured bird. The joining was gentle, patient, despite the urgency thrumming between them. Thomas touched her with reverence, as if she were something precious that might shatter. Clara had expected pain. Her married friends had warned her, but there was only a brief discomfort lost in the wonder of connection. They moved together by instinct and firelight, whispering wordless promises into each other's skin. Afterward, they lay entwined, Clara's head on Thomas's chest, listening to his heartbeat slow. Through the small window, stars burned in the desert sky, ancient witnesses to human folly and human love. "No regrets?" Thomas asked, his fingers combing through her hair. Clara thought of all the proper things she should feel: shame, fear, worry for her reputation. Instead, She felt only a profound rightness, as if all her wandering had led to this moment, this man, this place beyond society's reach. "None," she said firmly. "You?" His arms tightened around her. "Only that I have so little to give you. You gave me life." Clara reminded him. Everything else seemed small compared to that. They made love again as the stars wheeled overhead. Slower this time, learning each other's rhythms and responses. When exhaustion finally claimed them, they slept deeply, naturally, as if they had been sharing a bed for years instead of hours. Clara woke to morning light and the sound of Joseph's flute playing outside, a joyful tune that spoke of celebration and blessing. Beside her, Thomas stirred, his face younger in sleep, the guarded walls completely down. "Good morning," she whispered when his eyes opened. He studied her for a long moment, as if verifying she was real. Then he smiled, a true smile that transformed his face, and pulled her close. "Good morning, gray eyes." They rose and dressed, suddenly shy in daylight. But when they descended the ladder together, Joseph's knowing look held only warmth. He had prepared breakfast, a feast by their simple standards, and set 3 places with careful ceremony. "Eat," he commanded, but his eyes twinkled. New beginnings require strength. As Clara took her place at the rough wooden table, Thomas's hand found hers. She looked around the simple cabin that had become more home than anywhere she'd lived. At the old man who'd shown her kindness. At the man who'd saved her in every way a person could be saved. Outside, the desert stretched endless and harsh. The future remained uncertain, full of challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But here, in this moment, with Thomas's fingers intertwined with hers and Joseph's blessing hanging in the air like incense, Clara felt the solid ground of belonging beneath her feet. She had traveled 3,000 miles seeking one man's promise, only to find another man's truth. And in that truth, she had discovered herself. The need for salt drove them to town 3 months after Clara had first arrived at the canyon. She had resisted going back to Dust Hollow, but their supply had run out, and the nearest trading post was even farther. Thomas offered to go alone, but Clara insisted on accompanying him. She was no longer the desperate woman who'd slept in a stable. She wore Rebecca Red Elk's practical clothing with confidence, her hair braided in the style Thomas had taught her, her hands brown and capable from months of desert living. Still, as they rode into Dust Hollow's main street, Clara felt her stomach tighten. Eyes followed their progress, some curious, some hostile. She kept her chin high, focusing on their purpose. At Morrison's general store, Jake Morrison himself stood behind the counter, his pale eyes narrowing as they entered. "Don't serve your kind here," he said, looking pointedly at Tomas. "We have money," Clara said clearly. "We need salt and flour." Morrison's gaze shifted to her, and his expression became uglier. Well, the Eastern lady who couldn't find herself a living husband, heard you took up with a half-breed? Guess any bed's better than a cold stable, eh?" Clara felt Tomas tense beside her, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. "We'd like 2 pounds of salt and 10 of flour. Mr. Morrison." "Didn't you hear me?" Morrison leaned across the counter. "I don't serve Indians or their The word never finished. Tomas moved faster than Clara had ever seen him move, his hand shooting across the counter to grab Morrison's shirt front. "Finish that word," he said quietly, "and I'll forget my mother taught me to be civilized." Morrison's face purpled. "Get your filthy hands off me." "Gladly." Thomas released him with a slight shove. "Come on, Clara. We'll trade elsewhere." They left to the sound of Morrison's curses. On the street, Clara noticed several women watching from doorways. Mrs. Henderson stood among them, her face unreadable. As they passed, one younger woman, Clara remembered her from her first day, heavily pregnant then, holding a baby now, stepped forward. "Mrs. Morrison trades fairly," she said quietly, glancing around nervously. "2 streets over, she understands about difficult situations." Clara thanked her. and they found the small trading post run by a Mexican woman who indeed dealt with them fairly, though her prices were higher than Morrison's. As they loaded their purchases, the same young woman appeared again. "I'm Mary Sullivan," she said quickly. "I wanted to say what you did in there, standing up to him. We all wanted to, sometime or another, but—" She trailed off, then thrust a small package at Clara. "Seeds, from my garden. Thought you might like something growing out there." Clara accepted the gift with surprise and gratitude. As Mary hurried away, she realized that not everyone in Dust Hollow was hostile. Some were simply trapped by their own circumstances, much as she had been. The ride home was quiet, but Clara could feel the tension radiating from Thomas. "Finally," she said. "You wanted to hit him. Wanted to do more than that." His knuckles were white on the reins. "The things they say about you are just words. They can't hurt me anymore." He glanced at her, and she saw pain in his eyes. "They call you those things because of me, because you chose—" "I chose life," Clara interrupted firmly. "I chose love. Let them say what they will." That night, Thomas was especially tender with her, as if trying to apologize with touch for the world's cruelty. Clara held him close, feeling the weight of what their connection cost them both. A week later, she learned she was pregnant. The knowledge came with familiar signs her mother had whispered about years ago. Clara sat by the stream, hand pressed to her still flat stomach, overwhelmed by joy and terror in equal measure. A child, in this harsh place, with no doctor for 60 miles, no proper anything. She found Thomas working on a new addition to the cabin. He'd been expanding slowly, adding small comforts. When she told him, he went completely still, the hammer falling from nerveless fingers. "A child," he repeated, wonder and fear warring in his voice. "Yes." Clara watched his face anxiously. Is it welcome?" He crossed to her in 2 strides, dropping to his knees and pressing his ear to her belly, as if he could already hear the life within. "Welcome." He looked up at her with suspiciously bright eyes. "Clara, you've given me everything. And now this." They told Joseph that evening. The old man wept openly, reaching to place a blessed hand on Clara's stomach. "A grandchild," he marveled. "I thought I would die without seeing the line continue." But joy was tempered with practical fears. Clara threw herself into learning everything she could about childbirth and infant care, from the few books they had and Joseph's memories of his wife's pregnancies. Thomas became even more protective, trying to take all heavy work upon himself, until Clara firmly reminded him that desert women had been bearing children for thousands of years without being treated like porcelain. It was Mary Sullivan who became an unexpected ally. She appeared at the canyon one day, her own baby on her hip, having somehow discovered their location. "Heard you might need some advice," she said simply. "Had 3 of my own now. Figure women got to help each other out here." Through the long months of pregnancy, Mary visited when she could, bringing supplies and knowledge. She taught Clara exercises to prepare her body, herbs to ease the discomforts, signs to watch for. More importantly, she brought friendship, another woman to talk to about fears and hopes. Clara learned Mary's own story, married at 15 to a man chosen by her father, bearing children yearly, finding small rebellions where she could. "When I saw you that day, standing up to Jake Morrison, it was like seeing what I wished I could be," Mary confided, "made me braver, somehow." The attack came in Clara's 7th month. She was alone, Thomas hunting, Joseph napping when she heard horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. Clara grabbed the rifle Thomas had taught her to use and stepped onto the porch. 5 men, led by Jake Morrison himself, rode into their clearing. Morrison's eyes glittered with malice and liquor. "Well, boys, looks like we found the nest. This is private property," Clara said steadily, though her heart hammered. "You need to leave." Morrison laughed. "Private? Nothing's private when it comes to keeping our territory clean." He dismounted, his men following. "Heard you're breeding with the savage. Can't have that. Bad enough he exists. We won't let him make more. Clara raised the rifle. One more step and I'll shoot. You won't shoot. Morrison kept advancing. Eastern ladies don't have the stomach for... The rifle cracked. Dust exploded at Morrison's feet, stopping him cold. Clara worked the lever, chambering another round, grateful for the hours of practice Thomas had insisted on. The next one won't miss, she said coolly. Morrison's face contorted with rage, but before he could speak, Joseph emerged from the cabin, his old cavalry rifle steady despite his frail hands. And from the ridge above, Thomas appeared on horseback, rifle aimed at the group below. Gentlemen, Thomas called down, his voice carrying clearly. You're surrounded and outgunned. I suggest you leave while you can still ride. It was a bluff. They were only 3 against 5, but Morrison couldn't know that. He looked between Clara's steady aim and Thomas's position on the high ground, calculating odds. This isn't over, he snarled finally. The territory's got laws about squatting on government land. We'll be back with papers, legal-like. They mounted and rode out, but Clara knew the threat was real. That night, as they discussed options, she felt the baby kick strongly, a reminder of what they were fighting to protect. We could go north, Thomas suggested. Wyoming, maybe Montana. Running won't solve anything, Joseph said quietly. I ran once. Your mother paid the price. Clara thought of Mary Sullivan, of the young woman who'd given her seeds, of all the women trapped in lives they hadn't chosen. What if we didn't run? What if we fought back, but smart? The men looked at her questioningly. Morrison mentioned laws and papers. Well, laws work both ways. A plan was forming in her mind, built on skills from her old life she'd thought useless here. I can read and write better than most, and there's a lawyer in Springer who Mary says is sympathetic to difficult cases. That's a week's ride. Thomas protested. In your condition? My condition is pregnant, not dying. Clara's jaw set stubbornly. These men want to destroy us because we dare to exist, dare to love, dare to create life together. I won't let them. The journey to Springer tested every skill Clara had learned. They traveled carefully, camping rough, avoiding towns. The lawyer, Thomas Brennan, was indeed sympathetic, an Irish immigrant who knew about prejudice firsthand. He helped Clara file a homestead claim on their canyon land, using a provision that allowed women to claim property independently. It's not bulletproof, he warned, but its legal standing makes it harder for them to simply drive you off. The return journey was harder. Clara's pregnancy made riding painful, and they had to stop frequently. But she persevered, driven by determination to secure a future for her child. They arrived home to find Mary Sullivan waiting with urgent news. Morrison had indeed returned with territorial marshals, but finding the property legally claimed, had been forced to withdraw. He was rallying support for other measures, trying to prove Tomas was a criminal, that Clara was incompetent. Anything to invalidate their claim. Let him try, Clara said grimly. She penned letters to newspapers in Santa Fe and even Denver, describing their situation in terms calculated to win sympathy. A widow trying to make an honest life, facing persecution from powerful men. She didn't mention Tomas's heritage directly, but wrote of unjust prejudice and American citizens denied basic rights. The story spread slowly but surely. Other mixed families, hidden throughout the territory, began to speak up. A minister in Santa Fe preached about Christian charity. A judge's wife organized a letter-writing campaign. Morrison found his business boycotted by Mexican traders and several ranch wives. The territorial governor, facing pressure, sent word that all legal claims would be respected regardless of the claimants' backgrounds. It wasn't victory. Not completely. The hatred remained, simmering beneath the surface. But it was breathing room, a chance to live without constantly looking over their shoulders. As Clara entered her final month of pregnancy, she stood on the canyon rim, watching sunset paint the rocks in brilliant hues. Tomas joined her, wrapping his arms around her swollen form. You did it, he murmured into her hair. You fought them and won. We did it, she corrected. All of us. The baby kicked, and they both laughed. Whatever came next, they would face it together, a family forged in adversity, stronger for the trials they'd endured. No regrets? Tomas asked, echoing his question from months before. Clara turned in his arms, seeing in his face all the love and strength that had saved her. Only one, she said, that I didn't find you sooner. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they made their way back to the cabin where Joseph waited with dinner. Home, family, future, all the things Clara had despaired of finding, discovered in the most unexpected place with the most unexpected people. The desert had tested her, transformed her, given her a strength she'd never known she possessed, and in return, she'd given it her heart, her life, her love, planted like seeds in seemingly barren ground, ready to bloom with fierce beauty against all odds. The mining company arrived like locusts in early spring, just weeks before Clara's child was due. 20 men with surveying equipment, pack mules loaded with supplies, and legal documents claiming mineral rights to the creek that was their lifeline. Clara watched from the cabin doorway as they set up camp barely a quarter-mile from their home, her hands protective over her swollen belly. "They can't do this," she said as Tomas returned from confronting the foreman. His face was grim. "They have papers. Territorial Commission granted them rights to explore and extract mineral wealth from unclaimed waterways. But we claim this land." "The land, yes, but apparently not the water rights. Different filing." He slammed his fist against the doorframe, a rare display of temper. "Morrison's money behind this, no doubt. If they dammed the creek for their operations, he didn't need to finish. Without water, their small farm would die. They would be forced to leave. Child or no child." That night, Clara lay sleepless despite her exhaustion. Outside, she could hear the miners' coarse laughter, see the glow of their fires. These men had no idea what this place meant, the sweat and blood that had gone into making it a home, the dreams planted as carefully as her garden seeds. By the third day, the miners had begun their destruction. They diverted part of the creek into sluice boxes, muddying the water downstream. They cut down cottonwoods that had stood for decades. Their dynamite blasts sent rock slides into the canyon, frightening the horses and causing Joseph's fragile health to worsen from the stress. Tomas confronted them again, trying reason, then threats. The foreman, a thick-necked man named Garrett, laughed in his face. "Got problems. Take it up with the commission." "Oh, wait, they don't listen to Indians, do they?" That evening, Tomas sat sharpening his knife with methodical strokes, the sound scraping against Clara's nerves. She knew that look, the same one he'd worn when Morrison's men had threatened them. But this time was different. This time they were vastly outnumbered. "Don't," she said quietly. His hand stilled. "They're destroying everything, and if you fight them, they'll hang you for it, legal or not." She moved to sit beside him, taking his hands. "We need to be smarter." But what smart looked like seemed impossible to see. The lawyer Brennan could file protests, but that would take months. They didn't have months. Already the reduced water flow was affecting the garden, the animals. It was Mary Sullivan who brought unexpected hope. She arrived with her wagon under cover of darkness, her husband supposedly believing she was tending a sick neighbor. With her came 2 other women, Maria Gonzalez, the Mexican trader, and, surprisingly, Helen Morrison, Jake Morrison's own daughter-in-law. Helen! Clara stared in shock at the young woman she'd seen only at a distance in town. "My father-in-law is a poison," Helen said quietly. "Has been since I married his son." "When Mary told me what they're doing here..." She straightened her shoulders. "I brought information, papers from Jake's office. The mining company's not just after minerals. They're planning a larger operation, redirecting the whole water system to support a stamp mill. Would dry up half the county's small farms." Clara felt a spark of hope. Others would fight this if they knew. "Exactly." Mary leaned forward. "Which is why we're here. Helen can get more documents. Maria knows every small farmer and rancher who depends on these water systems. And you You can write. Make people understand what's at stake. They worked through the night, Clara penning letters despite the cramping in her back that had been growing stronger all day. By dawn, they had a plan. The women would spread word quietly, gathering support from those who'd suffered under Morrison's control. Clara would document everything: the illegal diversion, the environmental destruction, the threat to established homesteads. As the women prepared to leave, Clara felt a sharp pain that made her gasp. Mary's experienced eye took in her pale face, the way she gripped the table. "How long have you been having pains?" "Since yesterday, but—" Another contraction cut her words short. "Lord have mercy, you're in labor." Mary turned to the others. "Change of plans. Helen, ride for Mrs. Chen, she's the closest thing to a midwife. Maria, we need hot water, clean cloths." "I can't," Clara protested. "The letters can wait." Thomas was beside her instantly, his face tight with concern. "The baby can't." What followed were the longest hours of Clara's life. The labor was hard, complicated by her exhaustion and stress. Outside, they could hear the mining operation continuing, explosions shaking the cabin walls at the worst possible moments. Mary and Mrs. Chen, who arrived within hours, worked with calm efficiency, but Clara caught the worried looks they exchanged. "Something's wrong," she gasped between contractions. "Baby's turned wrong, Mrs." Chen said quietly. "We need to help it along." Thomas held Clara's hand as she screamed through the pain of Mrs. Chen's manipulations. She was dimly aware of Joseph praying in his native language, of Maria brewing strengthening teas, of Helen standing guard at the door as if she could keep the chaos outside at bay through sheer will. The sun was setting when the baby finally turned. Clara felt the shift, the sudden rightness, and with the next push, her child slid into the world. A daughter, small but fierce, her first cry cutting through the sound of distant dynamite. "She's perfect," Mary said, cleaning the infant and placing her in Clara's exhausted arms. Clara looked down at the tiny face, Thomas's angular features softened by her own rounder ones. Skin a beautiful blend of both parents, eyes that would likely darken from newborn blue to her father's deep brown. "Sarah," she whispered, "after your grandmother." Thomas made a sound that might have been a sob, touching his daughter's cheek with one trembling finger. "She's so small. How can something so small be so perfect?" But their joy was short-lived. The next morning, Garrett himself appeared at their door, backed by several armed men. "Got orders to expand operations," he announced. "This whole area has been designated for industrial use. You've got a week to clear out. We have legal claim." Clara began from her bed, holding Sarah close. "Had past tense." Garrett threw papers on the table. "Territorial Commission reviewed and revoked. Seems there were irregularities in your filing." Morrison's work. No doubt. Clara felt rage burn through her exhaustion. These men would drive them out now, with a newborn baby. Joseph still frail. Everything they'd built threatened. "You can't do this," Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. Garrett's hand went to his gun. "Try and stop us. Breed. Give me a reason." For a moment, violence hung in the air like smoke. Then Sarah whimpered, and the sound seemed to break the spell. Thomas stepped back, but his eyes promised this wasn't over. After Garrett left, they convened a war council. The women had returned, bringing others, a network of those wronged by Morrison, those who understood what the mining company's expansion meant for everyone downstream. "We fight," Maria said fiercely. "My people know these canyons. We can make their operations difficult." "Sabotage would only bring the army," Helen warned. She held up more papers. "But this, records of bribes to the commission, proof of Morrison's illegal dealings. If we could get this to the right people—" "The governor's wife," Clara said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. She led the letter campaign before. If she knew children would go thirsty because of this. It was desperate, but it was hope. They divided tasks, some to slow the miners through peaceful means, others to spread word. Clara to write the most important letter of her life while nursing her daughter. The next days blurred together. The miners found their equipment mysteriously breaking. Their supply wagons took wrong turns. Guided by helpful locals into box canyons, work crews discovered the ground they'd cleared had sprouted new obstacles overnight. Meanwhile, the letters flew. Clara wrote to newspapers, to politicians' wives, to church leaders. She told Sarah's birth story, how dynamite shook the walls as she labored, how her daughter's first breath came tainted with dust from destroyed land. Helen smuggled out more evidence. Mary organized the town women in a letter-writing campaign that flooded the governor's mansion. The turning point came when a Santa Fe newspaper picked up the story. "Baby born under siege," the headline read. The accompanying editorial asked sharp questions about mineral rights versus human rights, about who decided which citizens deserved protection under the law. More newspapers followed. A photographer arrived to capture images of the destroyed creek, the struggling gardens, the families affected. Clara, still weak from childbirth, posed with Sarah by their contaminated water source, and the image spread like wildfire. The governor's wife did more than write letters. She arrived in person, accompanied by several society ladies and a federal marshal. They toured the destruction, interviewed families, held Sarah while Clara wept from exhaustion and relief. "This is unconscionable," the governor's wife declared, her Eastern accent sharp with indignation. "These people are trying to build civilization in the wilderness, and they're being driven out by greed." The federal investigation that followed revealed what Helen's documents had suggested: massive corruption in the Territorial Commission, bribes, and falsified claims. Morrison and several officials were arrested. Garrett and his men were ordered to cease operations immediately. Their claims invalidated. But victory came with a price. The night before the miners left, fire broke out in the canyon, whether by accident or design. Flames swept through, destroying the cabin Tomas had built with such care. They escaped with their lives and little else, Joseph's health finally breaking under the strain. They sheltered in the cave where Thomas had once protected Clara from the sandstorm, watching their home burn. Sarah cried in Clara's arms, upset by the chaos and smoke. Joseph lay on a makeshift bed, his breathing labored. "I'm sorry," he whispered to Thomas. "I wanted to see her grow." "You will," Thomas said fiercely. But they all knew better. Joseph died as dawn broke over the blackened canyon. They buried him on the ridge overlooking the land he'd loved, the place where his wife had taught their son to dream of belonging. Clara held Sarah while Thomas spoke words in his mother's language, then his father's, bridging both worlds in farewell. Standing by the grave, looking at the destruction below, Clara felt despair threaten. They'd won the legal battle but lost so much. Where would they go now? How would they start over with nothing? "We rebuild," Thomas said, reading her thoughts. "The creek still flows. The land endures. We endure. But everything's gone. Not everything." He touched Sarah's sleeping face. Then Clara's cheek. The most important thing survived. Mary Sullivan arrived that afternoon with a wagon full of supplies and a proposition. Town's in uproar over what happened. Even some who stayed quiet before are speaking up now. They're saying if you rebuild, they'll help. Proper help this time. And they came. Ranchers with lumber, farmers with seed, women with furnishings saved from their own lean homes. Even some who'd shunned them before arrived to help raise new walls. The fire and fight had broken something loose in Dust Hollow. Not all the prejudice, but enough to let cooperation through. Helen Morrison came too, defying her father-in-law openly now. "He's finished in this town," she said with satisfaction. "My husband's taking over the store, and things will be different." They built not just a cabin, but a proper house, with a room for Sarah and space for the medical supplies Clara had begun gathering. She'd helped birth 3 babies during the rebuilding, her reputation as a healer growing. Women who would never have acknowledged her before now sought her knowledge. As autumn arrived, Clara stood in her new garden, Sarah tied to her back in the way Thomas had taught her. Planning rows for spring planting, the house rose behind them, stronger than before. The creek ran clear, the mining equipment hauled away for scrap. Tomas found her there as sunset approached, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Any regrets?" he asked. Their old question. Clara thought of the long journey from Philadelphia, of Emmett's empty promises and cold stables, of fever and fire and fight. Then she looked at what they'd built, not just walls and gardens, but community forged in crisis, acceptance earned through perseverance. "No," she said, leaning back into his warmth while Sarah gurgled contentedly. No regrets at all. The desert had tested them with everything it had, drought and storm, prejudice and violence. But they'd learned its deepest lesson, that even in the harshest ground, love could take root and bloom. And like the desert flowers that waited years for rain, when it finally came, the blooming was all the more glorious for the wait. The territorial courthouse in Santa Fe stood like a fortress of justice, its adobe walls baking under the June sun. Clara adjusted Sarah on her hip, the 15-month-old fascinated by the bustling plaza outside. Beside her, Thomas stood rigid in his best clothes, a suit borrowed from Thomas Brennan that didn't quite fit his broad shoulders. Around them, the corridor buzzed with nervous energy from their unexpected alliance of supporters. "They're ready for you," Brennan said. Emerging from the courtroom, his Irish face was grave but determined. "Remember, Judge Patterson is fair, but he's still bound by territorial law. We need to prove not just moral right, but legal standing." Clara nodded, her free hand finding Thomas's. They'd known this day would come when they'd decided to fight for formal recognition of their water rights, not just for themselves, but for every small holder threatened by powerful interests. The courtroom was packed. Clara recognized many faces: Mary Sullivan in her Sunday best, Maria Gonzalez with a delegation of Mexican farmers, Helen Morrison defying her family openly, even Mrs. Chen from Dust Hollow. But there were strangers too, drawn by newspaper coverage of the Canyon Creek case that had become a symbol of larger struggles. Across the aisle sat their opposition: lawyers for the mining interests, territorial commissioners who'd had their corruption exposed, and Jake Morrison himself, out on bail and radiating hatred, his eyes fixed on Sarah with such venom that Clara instinctively turned the child away. "All rise for the Honorable Judge William Patterson." The judge was younger than Clara expected, with intelligent eyes that took in the packed courtroom with interest. "Be seated. We're here to determine the matter of water rights for Canyon Creek and surrounding territories. Mr. Brennan, you may begin." What followed was a battle fought with words instead of weapons. Brennan laid out their case methodically: the original land claims, the corruption that had led to their near revocation, the broader implications for territorial development. He called witnesses, farmers who testified about water needs, Helen Morrison with documented evidence of bribery, the governor's wife herself speaking about the necessity of protecting legitimate settlers. Then Clara was called to testify. She handed Sarah to Mary and approached the witness box, aware of every eye upon her, some hostile, some supportive, all curious about the Eastern woman who'd defied convention. "State your name for the record." "Clara Whitmore Red Elk." She used both names deliberately, seeing Morrison's lawyer smirk. "Mrs. Red Elk." The prosecutor drew out the name mockingly. "You claim water rights to Canyon Creek. On what basis?" "On the basis of legal homestead, improved land, and continuous occupation as required by territorial law." "And you filed this claim as an unmarried woman?" "Yes. The Homestead Act allows single women to file claims." "But you're not unmarried now, are you?" The prosecutor's tone turned sly. "In fact, isn't it true you're living with a man to whom you're not legally wed?" Clara had expected this attack. "Thomas Red Elk and I exchanged vows before his father and our community. We consider ourselves married." "Consider?" The prosecutor pounced. "But there's no legal record, is there? No minister, no license. Just a private arrangement with a half-breed savage." "Objection!" Brennan was on his feet. "Counselor is badgering the witness and using inflammatory language." "Sustained. Counsel will maintain professional decorum." But the damage was done. Clara saw doubt creeping into some faces, the old prejudices stirring. The prosecutor continued his attack, questioning her morals, her fitness to hold property, the legitimacy of her daughter. Clara's temper, usually so controlled, began to fray. When the prosecutor suggested she was a woman of loose virtue who'd taken up with the first available man, something snapped. She stood abruptly, startling everyone. "Your Honor, may I speak freely?" Judge Patterson looked intrigued. "This is irregular, but proceed." Clara turned to face the packed courtroom. "You want to know about my virtue? Very well. I came to this territory as a mail-order bride, promised to a man who was dead when I arrived. I was left destitute, turned away by the good Christians of Dust Hollow, forced to sleep in a stable. Not one of your proper citizens offered aid to a desperate woman. Not one." Her voice grew stronger. "Thomas Red Elk saved my life. He gave me shelter without condition, taught me to survive, treated me with more honor than any civilized man I'd encountered. Yes, we fell in love. Yes, we created a child. Yes, we live as husband and wife without your official papers. If that makes me a woman of loose virtue, then I ask you, what virtue is there in a society that would let a woman starve rather than accept help from someone of mixed blood?" The courtroom erupted. Judge Patterson gavelled for order, but Clara wasn't finished. "You question my fitness to hold property? I've improved that land, brought water to crops, helped birth babies for women who once shunned me, created a home from nothing. I've fought fire and flood and men who would steal what we've built. If that doesn't make me fit, then your laws mean nothing." "Mrs. Red Elk." The judge's voice cut through the noise. "Are you finished?" Clara's passion spent, she suddenly felt exposed. Yes, Your Honor, I apologize for the outburst." "No apology needed. Sometimes the court needs to hear truth spoken plainly." Judge Patterson's eyes held something that might have been approval. "You may step down." As Clara returned to her seat, taking Sarah back into her arms, she felt the shift in the room. Women who'd been silent were whispering. Men who'd been hostile looked thoughtful. Even some who still disapproved seemed moved by her fierce honesty. Tomas testified next, speaking quietly but firmly about his family's presence on the land for generations. His mother's death, his father's recent passing, when Morrison's lawyer tried to paint him as a dangerous savage. Thomas responded with dignity that made the attacks seem petty. "I've harmed no one who didn't threaten my family first," he said. "I've lived peacefully, traded fairly, asked only to be left alone. If defending my home makes me savage, what does destroying it for profit make you?" The trial continued for 3 days. Witnesses came forward Clara hadn't expected. The young woman who'd given her seeds that first day. A rancher who'd quietly observed Tomas's fair dealings for years. Even the Mexican trader who'd sold them supplies when others wouldn't. On the final day, something extraordinary happened. As closing arguments began, a commotion arose outside. The courtroom doors opened, and a delegation of native elders entered, led by a woman whose bearing commanded immediate respect. "Your Honor," she spoke in accented but clear English, "I am Maria Crow Feather, Speaker for the Pueblo Council. We come to testify." Judge Patterson looked surprised but nodded. "This is irregular, but given the nature of this case, please continue." Maria Crow Feather spoke of Tomas's mother, Rebecca, who'd been adopted by their tribe after showing kindness to their children. She spoke of water rights that predated any American claim, of Joseph Red Elk's honor, of the discrimination faced by those caught between worlds. "This young man," she indicated Tomas, "carries 2 bloods but belongs to the land more truly than those who would steal it. The woman beside him has shown courage our grandmothers would recognize. Their child represents a future where such divisions might heal. We support their claim." The testimony of the tribal delegation swayed even hardened skeptics. When Judge Patterson retired to consider his decision, the courtroom hummed with tension. He returned within an hour. "This case represents more than water rights," he began. "It touches on fundamental questions of who belongs, who decides, and what kind of territory we're building. Clara held her breath, Sarah sensing the tension and whimpering softly. The evidence clearly shows corruption in the original revocation of the Red Elk claim. It also shows continuous occupation, improvement of the land, and valid filing under existing law. The fact that the claimants are not traditionally married is irrelevant to property law. The fact that Mr. Red Elk is of mixed heritage is also irrelevant under the Constitution. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. However, this court recognizes that legal decisions exist within social contexts. Therefore, I'm going beyond simply affirming the Red Elk water rights. Morrison's lawyers looked alarmed. Clara gripped Thomas's hand tighter. I'm establishing broader precedent. Water rights in this territory will be determined by beneficial use and prior claim, not by the race or social standing of claimants. Furthermore, I'm recommending investigation of all territorial commission decisions over the past 5 years for evidence of similar corruption. The courtroom exploded. Some cheered. Others protested. Morrison lunged to his feet, shouting obscenities until bailiffs restrained him. Through it all, Judge Patterson continued, I'm also ordering damages paid to the Red Elk family for the destruction of their property during illegal mining operations. The amount should allow them to rebuild properly. He looked directly at Clara and Tomas. This territory needs families like yours, those willing to work hard, stand firm, and bridge differences. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. With a final gavel strike, he ended the session. Clara found herself crying, Sarah patting her face in concern. Around them, supporters pressed close with congratulations. Mary Sullivan hugged her fiercely. Maria Gonzalez blessed them in rapid Spanish. Even Helen Morrison, defying her father-in-law's rage, came to shake their hands. But it was the quiet nod from Maria Crowfeather that meant the most, an acknowledgement that transcended legal victories. Outside the courthouse, in the bright Santa Fe sun, Clara and Thomas stood with their daughter, trying to absorb what had happened. They'd won more than a court case. They'd established precedent that would protect others, had forced recognition of rights previously denied. It's not over, Thomas warned quietly. Morrison and his kind won't accept this easily. I know. Clara shifted Sarah to her other hip. But it's a beginning, and beginnings matter. As they prepared for the journey home, strangers approached, some to congratulate, others simply to look at the family that had challenged the established order. A photographer asked to capture their image, and they stood together, Thomas proud and protective, Clara holding Sarah, who reached out one small hand as if to grasp the future itself. That photograph would circulate widely, becoming a symbol of changing times. But for Clara, the real victory was simpler. They could go home to their canyon, rebuild without fear, raise their daughter in peace. The water would flow, the gardens would grow, and maybe, just maybe, the world would become a place where Sarah could be proud of both sides of her heritage. As their wagon rolled out of Santa Fe, Clara looked back once at the courthouse where justice had, against all odds, prevailed. Then she looked forward, toward home, toward Tomas, toward all the tomorrows they'd fought to secure. No regrets? Tomas asked, their old refrain taking on new meaning. None, Clara said firmly. We're going home. And home, she knew now, was not a place but a promise of water freely flowing, love freely given, and the right to exist freely in a land vast enough for all who dared to dream. Wyoming territory stretched before them endless and promising, the mountains rising like hope itself against the horizon. Clara stood beside the loaded wagon, Sarah on her hip, watching Thomas secure the last of their belongings. 3 years had passed since the trial. 3 years of rebuilding and small victories, but also of continued harassment that had finally driven them to seek truly fresh ground. You sure about this? Mary Sullivan asked. Having come to see them off, her own family was considering the move north, inspired by the Red Elk's courage. Sure as anyone can be about starting over, Clara replied, hugging her friend. The clinic here is in good hands now. Doctor, Martinez knows everything I know. It still amazed her how she'd become the unofficial healer of Canyon Creek. Her knowledge gleaned from books, experience, and the teachings of Native women who'd gradually accepted her. But it was time for new challenges, new possibilities. The journey north took 3 weeks, through landscapes that shifted from desert to plains to mountain valleys. Sarah, now 4, delighted in every new sight, her bright chatter mixing English and the native words Thomas had taught her. She rode sometimes with her father, sometimes in the wagon with Clara, perfectly at home in both worlds. Their destination was a valley Thomas had scouted the previous year, 20 miles from the nearest town but blessed with good water, shelter from winter winds, and soil that promised abundance. As they crested the final ridge and saw it spread before them, Clara felt her heart lift. "Home?" Sarah asked, her small face hopeful. "Home," Thomas confirmed, his own expression lighter than Clara had seen in months. They built carefully this time, learning from past trials. The cabin went up strong and weather-tight, positioned to catch morning sun, but sheltered from storms. Clara established her garden with seeds saved from Canyon Creek, while Thomas constructed corrals and outbuildings. By autumn, they were well established, with stores laid by for winter and a small herd of horses beginning to thrive. The nearest town, Bridger's Rest, proved more welcoming than Dust Hollow had ever been. Founded by a mixed group of settlers, former soldiers, immigrant farmers, even a Chinese merchant family, it had a rough tolerance born of mutual necessity. When Clara offered her healing skills, she was accepted with pragmatic gratitude rather than suspicion. Their second winter in Wyoming, Clara opened a proper clinic in a small building at the edge of their property. Women traveled miles for her care, especially during pregnancy and birthing. She trained assistants, a young Shoshone woman named Blue Sky and a widow named Martha Brennan, who'd lost her husband to fever and needed purpose as much as income. Thomas, meanwhile, found his calling in breeding and training horses. His animals, combining native ponies' hardiness with Eastern breed size, became sought after throughout the territory. Men who might have scorned him elsewhere respected his skill in fair dealing. Sarah grew like a wildflower, strong and bright and fearless. She learned letters from Clara, tracking from Thomas, languages from everyone she met. On her 6th birthday, they enrolled her in the Bridger's Rest School, Clara's heart clenching with worry. "What if the other children?" she began that first morning. "Then they'll learn different." Thomas said firmly, "Our daughter knows who she is." And Sarah did. When a boy taunted her about her mixed blood, she calmly informed him that meant she was twice as smart as him, having 2 people's wisdom instead of 1. When the teacher seemed uncertain how to treat her, Sarah's quick intelligence won her over within days. Years flowed like the stream beside their home. Clara delivered hundreds of babies, treated countless ailments, became known as Doc Clara despite having no formal medical degree. She kept detailed journals, corresponding with Eastern physicians and learning constantly. When the territory established licensing for medical practitioners, she was among the first certified, her experience weighing more than formal education. Thomas's reputation grew as well. He was elected to the Territorial Council, a victory that would have been impossible in New Mexico. He spoke for small ranchers, for water rights, for fair treatment regardless of blood. His quiet dignity and careful words earned respect even from those who'd initially opposed him. One autumn day, as Clara worked in her expanded clinic, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. She looked up from treating a child's scraped knee to see a woman she barely recognized. Helen Morrison, aged beyond her years but with a peace in her face that had been absent before. "Helen?" Clara finished bandaging the child and sent him off with a candy from her jar. "What brings you to Wyoming?" "Freedom," Helen said simply. "Jake died in prison last year. His son, my husband, drank himself to death not long after. I sold everything and came north. Heard there was a town where people got fresh starts." Clara embraced her, feeling the circle close in unexpected ways. Helen settled in Bridger's Rest, opening a small shop that became a gathering place for women's meetings and community planning. When Sarah turned 16, beautiful and brilliant and determined to study medicine properly, Clara felt time's passage acutely. They stood together on the hill behind the house, watching sunset paint the mountains gold. I want to go to college back east, Sarah said. Study to be a real doctor, then come back and help our people. All our people. Clara's throat tightened. It won't be easy, even now. A woman doctor faces challenges, a mixed-blood woman. I know. Sarah's chin lifted in a gesture purely her father's. But you taught me that the hardest paths often lead to the most important destinations. They sent her off that fall with tears and prayers and all the strength they could give her. The house felt empty without her laughter, but letters came regularly, full of triumphs and struggles and determination that made both parents proud. Clara marked her 50th birthday working, as usual, delivering twins for a young couple who'd heard of her skill, as she cleaned up afterward, exhausted but satisfied. She found Tomas waiting with a gift. What's this? She opened the leather journal, finding it filled with pressed flowers from every place they'd lived, each one labeled in his careful hand. Our story, he said simply, so we don't forget. That evening, they sat on their porch, a real porch now, with carved rails and comfortable chairs. The Wyoming mountains rose around them, purple in twilight. The stream sang its eternal song. In the distance, lights glowed from other homesteads, a community where none had existed when they'd arrived. Any regrets? Clara asked, their ritual question taking on new weight with age. Thomas took her hand, still strong, still gentle. How could I regret the path that brought me you? A month later, Sarah's letter brought news that filled them with joy and trepidation. She'd graduated top of her class and been accepted to a prestigious medical residency. But more than that, she was engaged to a fellow doctor, James Chen, son of Chinese immigrants who understood what it meant to bridge worlds. She's living the future we fought for, Tomas said, pride and wonder in his voice. The wedding took place in their meadow the following spring, a celebration that brought together people from every phase of their journey. Mary Sullivan came from New Mexico with half of Dust Hollow. Maria Crowfeather arrived with a delegation of tribal elders. Colleagues from Sarah's medical school mingled with Wyoming ranchers, creating a tapestry of America's changing face. As Clara watched her daughter dance with her new husband, two young doctors who would serve communities that desperately needed them, she felt the weight and wonder of the journey. From a desperate woman in a stable to a respected healer, from an outcast to a pillar of the community, from loneliness to love that had weathered every storm. Late that night, after the guests had gone, Clara found her old journal from those first terrible days. She rarely read it anymore, but tonight seemed right for remembering, by lamplight. She turned to the entry she'd written that night in the stable, before Tomas had found her. The man I dreamed of, who wrote such beautiful letters, is dead. I am alone in a hostile place with no hope of rescue. Perhaps this is what I deserve for daring to dream of love. Clara closed the journal gently, looking through the window where Tomas was checking the horses one last time before bed, still caring for every creature under his protection. Tomorrow, Sarah and James would leave to establish their practice in California, serving immigrant communities there. The cycle would continue, the ripples of courage spreading ever wider. She rose and went to her desk, taking up her pen to add one final entry to that long-ago journal. The gentle husband I dreamed of never came. Instead, I found something better, a partner whose strength matched mine, whose love grew from shared trials rather than pretty words. He said I would be safe, and he kept that promise in ways I never imagined. Safety not just from physical harm, but safety to become who I was meant to be. In the end, we saved each other, and in saving each other, we perhaps saved a small piece of the world. As she sealed the journal, Tomas entered, carrying the scent of hay and horses and home. He read her expression and understood, as he always had. They stood together in the lamplight, no words needed after all these years, holding fast to what they'd built from nothing but courage and love. Outside, coyotes sang to the Wyoming moon, and the eternal mountains stood witness to one small, perfect triumph of the human heart. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love and perseverance in the Old West. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect with fellow story lovers from around the world. If you enjoyed Clara and Thomas's journey, please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of courage, romance, and survival on the American frontier. What did you think of their story? Share your thoughts below. I read every comment and would love to hear what touched your heart.